Hello, welcome to Mainline Mufon's program here at Radnor Studio 21. I'm Jennifer Stein, the founder of Mainline Mufon, and I want to invite all of our viewers to consider attending some of our programs. You can visit mainlinemufon.com. We have regular programming at the Tredyffrin Library that runs from September through June. The programs are usually free and they involve either films or authors, lectures, PowerPoint presentations on all sorts of fascinating topics. So I invite you to the website, and I'd like to tell you about our special guest here today with me from at Radnor Studio 21. Laird Scranton has come in from Albany, New York to be with us today. Let me read to you a little bit about Laird's background. He has written a series of books on ancient creation, mythology, and language. His goal was to learn more about the foundations of ancient religion by comparing the myths, symbols, words, and ritual practices of cultures from around the world. His studies began in the early 1990s with a modern-day African tribe from Mali known as the Dogon. Their traditions provide us with keys for unlocking many myths and symbols from ancient Egyptian religion, as well as Buddhism, Judaism, Taoism, and numerous other ancient traditions. Laird is one of the most unique people I know. He refers to himself as a comparative cosmologist. And I would agree. I've had the pleasure of hearing Laird a couple of times at different conferences that I've gone to. I think most recently I saw you at the CPEC conferences.
That's right.
Out in Las Vegas area, or
it was Rancho Mirage, I think.
That's right,
yeah.
right, and
Palm
maybe in Palm
Springs.
Springs.
Right.
But it was absolutely a fabulous lecture. I've been following your work, reading some of your books, and I'm so honored that you drove all the way down from Albany to present for our group. Thank you for coming.
Jennifer, thank you very much for inviting me to come down. You win the prize for coming the closest to pronouncing my name right. The name is actually pronounced Laird. It's
Laird.
a Scottish term.
Yes.
But I joke that I get called everything. I have a long list of Claire, Blair, Blaine, Lars, Leonard, whatever.
Oh.
But most people
Wow.
don't even recognize Laird as being a name.
Yes, well, I spend a lot of time in Canada, so I know a lot of Scottish people from Canada, so Laird is a very typical name up there. So I want to start right in the very beginning. For the viewing audience who's probably never heard of the Dogon, doesn't know what a comparative cosmologist is, let's talk about how you got started and why the Dogon. So wherever you want to begin about your interest, or was it with the Dogon that drew you right in, and who are the Dogon?
Okay, I really have to thank my wife Risa for unintentionally introducing me to the Dogon. The Dogon are a modern-day African tribe, a primitive tribe, that live in the desert about 8 hours distant from anything we'd consider to be civilized in Africa, in the northwest corner of the bulge of Africa in Mali. And I happened across them through a book called Unexplained by Jerome Clark. There was a chapter in that book about them that talked about a mystery of why they seem to know certain things about astronomy that they really shouldn't know without having access to powerful telescopes and modern equipment. And so that single mystery sort of drew me into them, and I started pursuing them, reading anthropological studies and the few books there are written about them, and starting to explore their tradition.
So what was your background before this? Was it just in computer engineering or software design? Or?
My degree is in English from Vassar College. I was one of the early male co-eds at Vassar.
Oh yes, 1969 they started. That's right.
My career was in computers, right? It has been in writing custom software for businesses and computers. And then in the mid-1990s, I started exploring this Dogon tribe just for my personal research, and ended up sort of accidentally writing a book. I was keeping notes, trying to keep it organized, and at a certain point realized that I had enough material to self-publish a book. And that book found a well-known Egyptologist named John Anthony West, and he arranged for it to be published. So That's sort of
wonderful.
the way.
And he's also a New York resident.
Yes, he is.
Yes,
he actually
in
is.
Schenectady, I think, or not too far.
Not too far. He's about 45 minutes south of Albany. He's in Saugerties, New York,
Oh, that's
near
right,
Woodstock.
Saugerties,
Near
that's
Woodstock.
right. It's a beautiful area. My daughter also went to Vassar, so I'm familiar with that neck of the woods. And you also have a lot of very ancient sites up in that area as well. Ancient stone monuments and things all throughout those mountain ridges up there as you look over the Hudson.
Yes, they do.
It's really fascinating. I would love to bring down some of the researchers on that. But back onto your topic, let's go back to talking about what you discovered that the Dogon know. Because for the listening audience who doesn't know about this, it is really fascinating. I have read Laird's work on this, and I'd like everyone to really have a clear background and understanding. So cosmologically speaking, they had this history within their tribe of a ritual and an historical relationship with their own lineage, correct?
Yes, the Dogon are a priestly tribe. They are very careful about preserving traditions and preserving words. One of the first things that made them interesting to me is that their culture is kind of a crossroads for important ancient traditions. They have rituals like Judaism, they have civic traditions like ancient Egypt, and they have a creation tradition, symbols and myths that are a lot like ancient Buddhism. And so it seemed like a very good place to start trying to sort things out about what the truth was about ancient religious traditions.
And how far back does their history go? We don't really know, correct?
Right, they don't have a written language, so we don't have written records to tell us exactly how far back they go. But you can sort of triangulate in on it, because many of their traditions are like ancient Egypt. But in ancient Egypt, we have a fairly clear timeline for things. For instance, we know that the Egyptians had certain calendars that the Dogon also have. But very early in Egyptian history, they reconciled these calendars using sort of leap year days. They had a set of 5 leap year days called intercalary days that they used to reconcile calendars. Well, the Dogon have the calendars, but they don't have the leap year days. That suggests that the Dogon interaction with Egypt was before those leap year days were introduced. There are other similarities like that. The Dogon don't have a written language, and written language was introduced very early in Egyptian culture also.
So are we talking 6,000, 7,000, 8,000
We're talking
BC?
sometime around 3,000 BC, just before written texts
started.
Appeared. Right. So the Dogon culture is enough like ancient Egyptian that you can almost predict that if the Dogon do a certain thing, the Egyptians did it also. As a matter of fact, a lot of the Dogon words that are used to describe this information they knew about astronomy it's all ancient Egyptian words. It took a long time before anybody, I think I was the person who noticed that. And I spent a lot of my work correlating the Dogon words to the Egyptian words based on multiple points of evidence. But one thing that makes the Dogon very, very interesting is that their priests say that their symbols describe how their tribal god created matter. Now, when I started out reading about them, I didn't know a lot about matter, but I could recognize that the description they have for what's the counterpart to an atom is a correct description, and they have a correct understanding of electrons and protons and neutrons that make up atoms. But they have this whole descending structure also from there that I didn't know about. And so I wondered if they have the top 2, stages of creation right, how about these descending stages? What's the possibility those might be right also? So I started comparing to works by modern astronomers like Brian Greene and Stephen Hawking. And in my first book, which is called The Science of the Dogon, I basically just set the Dogon descriptions and drawings side by side with modern science, and the reader can see that there's a match. Both things are describing the same thing in the same ways. And they understand the structure of matter from waves at the bottom all the way up to the atom at the top, and they even discuss some things that modern science doesn't discuss. They have some reasonable perspectives on what happened before the Big Bang that created the universe, and how it is that an act of perception can cause matter in its wave-like form to suddenly turn into particles. So there's lots of really interesting stuff there.
Like the fundamental building blocks of consciousness and the overlap that has with the creation of the world we know it. That's absolutely fascinating. It sounds like a noetic project for noetic sciences.
Yes, and then from
And a
there,
Dean Radin, research.
because of the similarities that I could see existed with these other traditions, I started using the Dogon culture as a basis for comparison to the other cultures. So anytime there was a ritual or a myth or a symbol the Dogon had that another culture also had, I started comparing the words and the descriptions they used to explain how they understood these symbols to try to sort of come to a consensus opinion about what does this symbol represent.
It's brilliant work that you've done, and having read one of your first books, I have to commend you on that, because as a reader, you really get led along on this logical step as you uncovered the material to make sense of it for the reader. So for the listening audience, let's describe one of the early Dogon myths that deals with a god figure that comes and teaches the Dogon some of the astrological.
Okay.
If that's
First,
the right place to start.
well,
I may be jumping ahead.
That's a good place to start. The way that we know about the Dogon is through studies that were done by French anthropologists for about three decades back in the 30s, 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Those anthropologists say that there is no single myth of creation in the Dogon tradition that describes all this, but there are a lot of little brief mythic interludes they describe that connect to other things. There's a Greek myth of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, and the Dogon have a similar myth. The Dogon actually don't celebrate, they don't actually worship a god. Where the ancient Egyptians have deities, the animal-headed deities that represent certain things, the Dogon have cosmological concepts. They have basically ideas and symbolic stages of creation of matter that correlate to those Egyptian deities. So to begin with, it's not really cast as gods. But what the Dogon say is that they got this information in ancient times from somebody who knew about science, somebody who knew more about science than they did, and that the symbolic system was tagged to what they call a civilizing plan. And that civilizing plan, the purpose of it was to teach them how to be farmers. Basically to teach hunter-gatherers how to be farmers. Now, part of what allows me to triangulate on these meanings is that the Dogon system of symbols is a match for an ancient Buddhist system of symbols that are given in an entirely different language. The Dogon words are Egyptian words, so I can correlate, I can demonstrate that the meaning of this Dogon word must be correct because it matches the meaning of an Egyptian word. The symbols, many of the symbols were adopted as glyphs in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, the drawings that the Dogon do to explain things. The Dogon priests say that they can't talk about a concept of creation without also drawing it. And so very often there's a description, but there's also a drawing that goes with it to sort of explain it. And I mean, I'm sort of that way too. I like to doodle while I'm explaining things.
But the drawing then also becomes symbolic for them as
Right.
part of their teachings.
It does, and it takes on more importance than that too. There are about 30 of those Dogon drawings that are a match for Egyptian glyphs that are used in Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. Same shape and the same meanings. And so I was able to use those to sort of leverage a new approach to understanding how the Egyptian hieroglyphic words work. It's really very simple when you think about it. It's a lot like ancient Chinese hieroglyphs. If I had had perfect knowledge, I would have started with an Egyptian word for week, like a day of a week. The Egyptian word for week is written with two glyphs. It's a circle with a dot in the middle of it, which is the sun glyph, and it represents the concept of a day, and an upside down U, which is the Egyptian number 10. And I looked at that word, and I said, this word, symbolically, what it says to me is 10 days. And I went and I did some research, and I discovered the Egyptians had a 10-day week. Amazing. The word told me something, a truthful fact about Egyptian culture I didn't know. Just the form of the word itself told me that.
Wow.
When I went on to do more study with ancient China and things like that, I discovered the Chinese have the same word. It's written with two glyphs, the Chinese sun glyph and the Chinese number 10, and they also had a 10-day week.
Wonder, was it often like a lunar calendar? Because the lunar calendar has more months in it than a solar calendar.
Right. The Dogon and the Egyptians both had multiple calendars for different purposes. They had a lunar calendar, well, a lot like the ancient Hebrew calendar. They had a solar calendar, which is the regular calendar year type calendar. They had a 360-day calendar like ancient Egypt has that researchers think was a ceremonial calendar. I have a little different view about that. They had a calendar that was based on Venus. So they had numbers of different calendars, but they're a match for the Egyptians.
Wow, and those calendars guided them in understanding of what they needed to plan for in their lives, especially around planting.
Right.
Because they were one of the earliest, farming communities of Africa that we know of, correct?
That's right. And the system of farming that they used, the system of land management that underlies farming for the Dogon is a match for an ancient system of land management in ancient China also. So there are commonalities there. But what I do through my books is I try to tie these things together in ways that are obvious, where a person can look at this one and look at that one, and there's an obvious intuitive match here. These are the same. These are not, these ideas fall into a realm where proof doesn't really apply in the sense of proving it to 5 decimal positions the way a scientist would like to.
Right.
The best
right.
you can really do is demonstrate the truth of something.
Right.
And that's what I'm trying to do with the books.
So these overlaps of traditions, as we've been discussing, between China and Egypt and the Dogon, and even within Judaism, does that imply that there was a primary teacher or a primary source? And do you have any opinions for the viewing audience about what that could be?
Yes, the reason it implies that is because the cultures themselves say that. For me, in the field of work that I do, comparing symbols and trying to come to interpretations of what a symbol represents, the biggest obstacle to my doing that is my own tendency, like any person's tendency, to see patterns even where they might not exist. You know, if you've ever had a child look up at the clouds and imagine pictures in the clouds, well, those aren't really, there's not really a picture of a puppy up there, but the child sees it. We're wired almost psychologically wired to see patterns whether they exist or not. So one of the rules that I make for myself about interpretations is it has to start with a statement on the part of the culture, a clear statement. Mm-hmm. And then you pursue that clear statement and say, does this make sense in terms of how they're describing other things? Does it make sense in terms of other cultures who have the same symbol and they make their statement about what it represented? So when you get to the bottom of all of these cultures, what they're all saying is, in one form or another, is these represent instructed concepts and instructed symbols. This is an instructed system. Now, as a programmer myself, there are certain techniques I use when I design a computer system that I could see somebody had used in relation to these symbols. There were techniques that make it easier for a person to remember what a symbol means, and makes it easier for someone who's never seen the system to figure out what the system is about. I could see that someone had used those techniques with these symbols, and that let me know early in my process that I was looking at what seemed to be a design system. Now, because my rule is that when two cultures give the same flat statement about a fact, about the way they interpret a symbol or about part of their system, that I need to at least consider that as being a realistic idea. My problem is I have two systems that are a match. I have the Dogon system of creation and the Buddhist system given in different languages. The Buddhist system is in Sanskrit. The Dogon system is in ancient Egyptian words, very different languages. So it's not likely that one culture got it from the other. Both cultures, both systems are documented to be ancient. The Buddhist system was documented by about 400 BC, but the Dogon system is being expressed in words that went out of use around 700 BC. So they're both ancient systems. But today, when we take a modern authority on Buddhism, he understands Buddhism in the same way that modern Dogon priests understand it. It's a match in the current day. And what that means is we have two cultures who managed to keep all of the complex details of that system straight for thousands of years. Now, my problem as a researcher is this, that the Buddhists say that their most sacred symbols they got from a non-human source. The Dogon say that they got it from a non-human source, but they go a little farther than that. They say not only was it not human, it was also not material. The Dogon and the Buddhists and other cultures, at the base of their system, they believe, or they state actually as fact, that universes come in pairs. There's a material one and a non-material one, and that there's a flow of energy between those two that they compare to the natural water cycle of rain evaporating to make clouds that falls on the mountains as rain and then flows back to the sea and rivers. And that cycle, they say there's a similar cycle of energy between this material universe and the non-material one. So now, because I have the two groups both saying they got it from a non-human source, I as a researcher am obligated, based on my way of doing business, to at least consider whether that might be true or not.
And it gets complicated.
And it starts to get complicated. Now, I can look at it, and I have really only two possibilities. I can say, here I have two cultures that kept every last detail of this complex system straight for thousands of years, but somehow they both misremembered one fact, and they both misremembered it in the same way. What are the chances of that? Or I can say, they kept all of those many details straight all the way down to the bottom, and they kept that last detail straight also. And if they kept that one straight, then I have to allow for the possibility that there was a non-human connection here in the system.
Now, am I correct in remembering that I also met you at an Electric Universe conference? Have you presented there?
No,
with
actually
Walt
I
Thornhill?
haven't. I've presented at CPAC conferences in Walter Crittenden runs.
Yes.
I've been to Paradigm Symposiums in Minneapolis.
Right.
I've done presentations to the ARE down in Virginia Beach.
Virginia Beach, right.
I've been in a couple of documentary series in John Anthony West's Magical Egypt, in Carmen Bolter's Pyramid Code series.
Yes,
and then occasionally.
And you've done a couple of Ancient Aliens, have you not?
No, I haven't. I was invited a couple of times, and I'm friendly with the people who were on that show, but in the end I haven't done an interview for them.
Well, you probably will quite soon. I wouldn't be surprised.
I've been cautioned. I've had friends who've done interviews with them and were disappointed about the way the interview ended up being edited, how things were presented. It made it sound like they were saying something they weren't really saying.
Right, because the show has an agenda. Yes.
Well, it's partly, I mean, it's a major part of this is entertainment, and they're trying to, like any entertainment show, they do have a theme they're trying to pursue.
Right.
And so they may be more, sometimes
I understand. I understand. Well, we all are sort of reaching in so many different disciplines now for a fundamental, crossing point where we can move back in time, like the discovery of Lucy, right? What does her skeleton mean? What does it teach us? We all want to know, where did we come from? Are we descendants of a species that came here from another planet, or did we just naturally evolve? Have we had intelligent help? And of course, we're trying to do that sort of in the same way biologically at the CERN Hadron Collider in Switzerland. We are going back to the most primary source of things.
That's right, trying to get to the bottom of it.
Yes, yes. I follow the work of Nassim Harim, who talks a lot about there being an inverse world similar to the physical world that we have, and that matter goes in and out of this physical form and non-physical form, physical form and non-physical form. Right. And many of the researchers that present at the Electric Universe Theories, I've been reading a number of different authors there. And there's also a very similar relationship to understanding the plasma-like nature of everything in the universe. So it's really...
It's interesting that you say that, because there's a scientific basis for thinking that there's a second realm there that we can't see. I sort of compare it to if you were to get in your car, I compare the scientific viewpoint to, imagine getting into your car and making the rule for yourself that from now on, all that you were going to accept as being real was what you could see through the windshield and what you could see in the mirrors. Now, you could probably drive your entire life believing that that was true and drive perfectly fine and never run into people, and things would be great. The problem is that we know that there is a blind spot big enough to hide a tractor trailer, in the spaces you can't see with the mirrors.
Yes.
Well, there's evidence that these kinds of blind spots exist for science, and the best demonstration of it is with fundamental particles of matter. these fundamental particles are classified into 4 groups based on basically it's based on symmetry. It's how they look from different angles. There's one kind of particle that looks the same from all sides, another kind that has to be turned halfway around before it looks the same, another kind that has to be turned all the way around before it looks the same, but there's a 4th kind called the half-spin particle that has to be turned around twice to look the same. Now,
Oh my.
that allows the possibility that the particle is entering and leaving a realm that we can't readily perceive. That's one possible explanation for why. So recently I was interested in finding out whether there was any geometry that defined these particles. And I discovered that there is, and the geometry that defines that half-pin particle, the one that looks like it might cross over between the 2 realms.
That has to be turned around twice before you can...
It's fundamentally the same geometry as what we call sacred geometry. It's the geometry that's used to align a Buddhist stupa. It's the geometry that we see again and again turning up in cultures as these shapes. It begins with the shape of the Egyptian sun glyph. Okay.
So it's like a fractal.
Yeah, this geometry is a thing, and the thing that it represents is the one kind of particle in our universe that has the potential to be connected to 2 universes.
Is that the spiral? Is it often the symbol of a spiral?
No, the spiral is really before that. The spiral exists before that. To explain what the spiral is, this ancient symbolic system ties to modern theories of how matter is created. There's a system of theories called string theory. There are different versions of it. And in string theory, the idea is that matter is created from vibrating threads. That what we see as particles are sort of different vibrations of these threads, just like what we hear as musical notes are different vibrations of a thread on an instrument, string on an instrument. In string theory, the fundamental unit of matter is created in 7 stages. It's a result of seven vibrations, or 7 little bubble-like dimensions that collapse down and form this fundamental unit that supposedly exists at every point of space and time. Now for the Dogon, they have a similar construct to that, but they look at it in several different ways. From one perspective, they look at it as 7 rays of a star of increasing length that emerge out of a central point. The other way they look at it is in terms of the spiral that can be drawn around those rays of that star that are of increasing length. And depending on which context they're discussing it in, they'll conceive of it one way or another. There's an additional set of ways they look at it. They group 2 of the rays as if they were a head. They sort of make it into a stick figure. They group 2 of the rays as if they were a head, and then the other 5 rays, they have 2 different ways of looking at. They either give it 4 arms and 1 leg, or if I say 4 arms and 1 leg, with 2 being the head, or they give it 2 arms, 2 legs, and a single tusk. Now those representations are the 2 ways that Ganesha, the elephant god in India, is represented. And there's all sorts of work that's done in this book, actually, that ties a study that a Yale professor named Phyllis Granoff did. She was studying the 8 incarnations of Ganesha, which she knew, based on her sources, represented 8 stages, sequential stages of creation of matter. But she didn't know, she didn't have anything to tie it to.
Well, it sounds to me, and I may be jumping the gun a little bit here, and tell me if I'm going off the wrong track, but one of those representations with 2 legs, 2 arms, and a single tusk sounds like a human figure, sounds like consciousness, sounds like in order for there to be matter, there has to be consciousness embodied in a being, for there to be consciousness brought into, or physical matter to be brought into awareness.
That connects, and it connects in a complicated way, and the way it connects explains why these symbols are so hard to understand sometimes. That in the way the Dogon look at it, there are 3 processes of creation that are considered to be parallel to one another. They talk about how the universe forms, they talk about how matter forms, and they talk about the stages of biological reproduction. Now for them, those three processes are so fundamentally similar that they use a single set, a single progression of symbols to represent all three of those processes at the same time. And so any symbol automatically has at least three meanings in relation to those three themes. So like the concept of a hemisphere, the shape of a hemisphere represents an expanded womb if we're talking about biology, but it represents the expansion of mass if we're talking about creating matter. Or in biological reproduction, that begins with the formation of an egg, and so the beginning of the universe is conceived of as a cosmogonic egg. And there's parallelism here that goes along with that. So if you think of matter as beginning with a primordial source, and the particles are just subdivisions of that source, they look at consciousness the same way. They say there's a primordial consciousness, and that individual consciousnesses are just subdivisions of that. But the way they conceive of that consciousness is also very interesting. They assign male and female symbolism to things as paired opposites, like the Egyptians do and other cultures do. And they have numerology. For them, 4 is the number of the male, 3 is the number of the female, and 7 is the number of the individual. Well, when they talk about the material universe, they always talk about it in terms of 4s and in terms of a masculine energy. When they talk about the non-material universe, they relate it to feminine energy, which implies the number 3. If you take that 3 and the number 4 together, what you're creating is an individual. And from that perspective, those two universes constitute an individual, and the consciousness would be the consciousness of a single individual.
It's absolutely stunning, isn't it?
It is.
While you were researching this, you must have been just woke up every day and were floored.
Yeah, and actually more than just what you would think, because in the archaic version of these traditions, the philosophies that underlie all this stuff, it's understood that part of that energy that's coming back and forth between the non-material and material universes includes efforts to communicate information. And that one way that happens is through dreams, and one way that happens is through what we might see as coincidental occurrences in life that aren't really coincidental. There are a number of different ways that it happens, but to wake up in the morning being astounded at something like this is something that sort of routinely happens in the mindset of the tradition because something was communicated overnight.
Yes, yes. Many people who claim they've had enlightening experiences, part of that enlightening process is recognizing a pattern of synchronicity in their own lives and then realizing that one thing is significantly tied to another and they can't avoid the empirical knowledge that's like staring them in the face.
One of the difficulties for somebody like me is that in order to write these books, I need to adhere very strictly to things that I can demonstrate as being true. And so there's a category of things where I can very confidently demonstrate this is this and that is that. And there's another whole category of things that I think are true or might be true or it's suggested are true, but that I can't firmly demonstrate have to be true. And so I'm constantly working sort of on two sides of this thing. Over time, things that I thought were just suggestions when I started out turn out to be very easy to demonstrate.
Yes, yes. Now, I have to ask you, because I am a lover of Gobekli Tepe. I see on the cover of this latest book which you've written, you have used some of the amazing T-shaped structures that stand there in San Lurfa, near San Lurfa in Gobekli. These are just absolutely amazing structures with magnificent carvings on them. Mm-hmm. Sophisticated stonework, standing erectly, and deliberately buried. Stonehenge-like structure that was deliberately buried, probably around 10,000, maybe as upwards as far in the past as 12,000 BC. This throws a curveball into our known history of man, because we believed at this period of time that man was really only hunter-gatherer, had not yet begun farming, had not yet begun language, and had not yet begun any kind of sophistication or of domestication of animals and organization of society. And it throws some real curveballs out there as to what began first. Did society begin because we were attempting to build structures? And for what purpose? We don't know what they mean, what they are. Why did you put this on the cover of this book, and how does the whole concept of Gobekli Tepe tie in with your other writings? If we can diverge
We
for
can.
that.
When you get to the bottom of the traditions I'm studying, they consistently say, they learned these things from somebody who knew more than they did in ancient times. Now, the Dogon say they got it from a non-material and non-human source. And they say that their teachers were very concerned because there were potential bad impacts on us from being around them. And they were concerned about what would happen over a long period of time if we had prolonged contact. What's the bad effect going to be on us from being around them? And their solution to that was they took 8 tribe members from each group, sequestered them someplace remote from the tribe, instructed those 8 in civilizing skills and in the cosmological system and the symbols and so forth, and sent them back to teach everybody else. So Gobekli Tepe looks to be, it has all of the attributes of what groups like the Dogon and the Buddhists and other cultures, how they describe the instructional sanctuaries where this knowledge was given. As a matter of fact, one of the prominent images on these pillars at Gobekli Tepe has to do with vultures. There are pictures of vultures or birds of prey on them. In Buddhism, it's understood that knowledge was first passed to humanity at a place called Vulture Peak in very ancient times. This is called Gobekli Tepe. In Egypt, we have a tradition of Zep Tepe as being their honored original time of that they refer all of their questions and their problems to the authority of. It's sort of, that's the ancient authority that they tie things back to. So this book, Point of Origin, was an effort to try to make sense of what we see at Gobekli Tepe in Turkey. There are symbols there. There are standing stones that are placed in circles with beautiful carvings of animals on them. And there are certain words and other factors that apply to that site that are that I think are symbolic. And so I was looking for a way to try to connect that forward to these other cultures who seem to be pointing back to it. How do you connect it? Turns out language for me was a key. These animals that are pictured on the pillars, the farther back in time, the more commonality of language you find. As an example of that, the word tepe for Gobekli Tepe, there are probably 25 meanings of that word in the modern Turkish language. If you go to the ancient Egyptian dictionary, you find at least a dozen of those same meanings pronounced tepe. Mm-hmm. So when the ancient Turks were saying tepe, chances are they meant the same thing that the Egyptians did. Mm-hmm. So when I saw these animals pictured on the pillars, my first question was, could these animals be meant to be cosmological? Are these cosmological symbols? So
like
I went to the
looking to star constellations, possibly, right?
Right. So I went to the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary to find the names of those animals and discovered they're all homonyms. They're pronounced like important cosmological terms. So it's as if a hunter-gatherer who didn't know how to read or write would stand in front of one of these pillars, see the picture of an animal whose name he knew. He could speak the name of the animal, and at the same time, he'd be speaking the term of cosmology he was being instructed in there. Using that as a starting point, I started examining ancient Egyptian names for the region where Gobekli Tepe is found and discovered it was pronounced Get-Petkai, which is, over 7,000 years, very close phonetically to Gobekli. And I started studying the structure of that word and some other words. This is formulated in a way that makes it look like the name of an archaic sanctuary. The name begins with a picture of a little shrine, and it ends with a picture of mountains. It looks like the name of a mountaintop sanctuary. So I started looking at other Egyptian words like that were formulated that way, that are considered archaic, and discovered that you could tie these things forward in very interesting ways. One was called Ga-Nu-Sa-Ast. Turns out the Get-Petkai that the Egyptians referred to this site by, that's a modern, how can I say, that's an archaic pronunciation of the glyphs that were used to write the name. If you could alternately pronounce them using modernized pronunciation, and when you do that, what it says is Het, Pet, Ka, Ya. Now, Pet is an Egyptian god who I associate with the concept of space.
Like outer space,
Or just
any space.
any sacred space, any kind of a space.
Gotcha.
Okay. Ka is an Egyptian god who I at the time associated with the concept of duality. He's represented by two connected hands like this. Ya was the Hebrew god of light. Now, when you look at another of these archaic names, it's formulated the same way in terms of three names, but the names are they are names of deities, but they're also names of astronomic bodies, and astronomic bodies we can recognize. One was pronounced that Ganu Sa Ast becomes Het Penu Sa Ast when you modernize the pronunciation. Now, Sa is Orion, and Ast is Isis or Sirius. Penu, I had not encountered Penu before, but my guess was, based on astronomy, I know that Sirius and Orion tie to a third astronomic body called Barnard's Loop. This is an almost invisible spiraling birthplace of stars that centers on the belt stars of Orion. You have to use time-lapse photography to be able to see it. The Dogon refer to it as the chariot of Orion, because when you image the light from that spiral, it looks like the wheel of a chariot that Orion the Hunter is standing in. So that put me on to the word Penu. I didn't know anything about Penu. When I started exploring that, I discovered that it ties to an archaic cult in India called the Shakti cult that have all the same iconic symbolism that we find at Gobekli Tepe. As a matter of fact, the term Gobekli Tepe, when they translate it, they usually translate it as Potbelly Hill.
Yes.
Well, one of the symbols of this archaic cult is a clay pot filled with water that symbolizes a womb, a woman's womb, that's called a potbelly. So even the language is tying us back to the site. And so that
fascinating.
Shakti cult is understood to be ancestral to the Vedic and the Buddhist and the Hindu traditions in India. But in my book, I also show how it ties into ancient Egypt around 4000 BC, how it ties to all the Dogon references. It's a very compelling match to be able to trace this forward that way. And it explains a lot of things about the later symbolism to be able to tie it back that way.
Now, there was an interesting author named Robert Temple,
right,
who wrote a book called The Serious Mystery.
Right.
And he talked about the Dogon knowledge as a result of direct alien contact. And when I hear those words, I'm assuming it means a species from a different planet who's advanced, who
right,
possibly came here to teach. And sounds like some of the information you're discussing leads the interpreter to ask the question, is it possible, and do you think, and do you cover this in your writing, or have you explored the possibility of a more advanced species coming here to teach us, and being cautious about how they interacted with us and teaching us and then departing or leaving?
Yes and no. Robert Temple's book, The Serious Mystery, was one starting point for me in learning about the Dogon. I don't completely agree with him about things he says in the book. It was a very good starting point for me, and I think he's on point in a number of places. He had the disadvantage when he was writing that the Dogon study that I work from hadn't been translated into English yet. One small piece of it had been, but most of it hadn't been. I was working from a full English translation of this French study. So he didn't have the ability to compare what he was saying back to what that study recorded as being true for the tribe.
Right.
And
so
I
his
think
conclusions might have been different had
yeah,
he
so
had
I think
that.
he might be a little bit off the mark on certain things. But the fact of the matter is that there are alternate ways of looking at various symbols. Any given symbol, there are alternate ways, partly because of those themes I was talking about, the parallel themes, but also because the Dogon described this whole system like an onion, like the skins on an onion. That you peel one back and there's another one there, and you peel that one back and there's another one there. And that's sort of the way the symbolism works. Well, when we're talking about this non-material and material universe, the sun, that sun glyph that represents Ra in Egypt becomes a symbol for the material universe. Sirius, the star, becomes a symbol for the non-material universe. And so because of that, certain things are explained. For example, in Egypt and for the Dogon, in their the main calendar they use, the year begins, even in the Hebrew calendar, the year begins with the heliacal rising of Sirius. What's the heliacal rising? It's during the course of the year, we can see Sirius from the Earth. But it reaches a point where Sirius is so close to the glare of the sun, from our perspective, that for 72 days or something like that, that goes through a period of time where you can't see Sirius from the Earth. And then suddenly, as it moves out of that glare, you can see it again. You see it just before dawn, just before sunrise. It leads the sun just before the two rise together. And when those two come together, that's the heliacal rising. Sirius meeting the sun, cosmologically, is a very significant thing because it represents the non-material meeting the material.
And does that happen around this time of year, around
Yes.
September?
Yes, it happens just about the time of New Year's in the Hebrew calendar, and for the ancient Egyptians and the Dogon and a lot of other cultures too. That's the explanation that the Dogon give for why that rise is important. Yeah, but you sort of have to triangulate on it a little bit. But
And I wonder if that's what the symbol is at the top of the pillars at Gobekli, because there seems to be a sun
sun
with a
glyph.
dot in the
Yes,
middle.
it does. But there's a second symbol on these pillars that people haven't been able to explain. It looks like the letter H.
Yes.
Now, that symbol actually survived into modern times in the Masonic tradition. And in the Masonic tradition, it represents a feminine energy coming together with a masculine energy as a prerequisite for creation. So it's a restatement of the philosophies that underlie this stuff. Even on the pillars of Gobekli Tepe, you can see 3 basket-type shapes, 3 handbag-type shapes that are there.
Yes, yes.
Okay, if you think of that as combining the shape of a hemisphere on top with the shape of a square below, those are symbols for the non-material and the material universes coming together. Reconciling a circle with a square becomes a metaphor for the non-material coming together with the material. Now, Gobekli Tepe, from my perspective, is a place where that happens. A dome in ancient times is a symbol for a temple, and a temple is a place where it's understood that the non-material comes together with the material.
Very
And there are probably a half a dozen different ways that symbols at Gobekli Tepe say that say, look, this is the place where the non-material came together with the material.
And you find that in some of the structures in early Japan as well, these rectangular temples with a domed roof on top of.
Now you're talking about Gobekli Tepe being deliberately buried. That also ties into the same concept. This comes down to some interesting symbolism. The idea of covering something over after you're finished with it, like a burial of a person who's died. There's an Egyptian word to cover over or to bury, and it's pronounced ark. The Dogon refer to that spiral we were talking about and the stages that create that spiral, and to temples which represent that same concept as representing an ark. A Buddhist stupa, the Dogon have a version of that they call an ark. Okay, so if we allow that Gobekli Tepe represented an ark, now here is an ark on a hillside near Ararat, deliberately covering it over symbolically names it, because by covering it over, you've used the word ark. Someone walks up and says, when they say it was covered over, they're declaring the name of the site. When you look at this Egyptian word ark in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, it's a series of symbols that sort of act out the process that happens in Judaism every day when they finish reading a scroll and they roll it back up and they place a cover over it and they tie it and they put it back in its cabinet, which is called an Aron HaKodesh, which is abbreviated to ark.
Yes.
So this concept of covering something over, for me, represents all of that. It says, we're finished with the instructional lesson here. It came to completion. Now we're closing it up. We're covering it over. We're tying it up. And we're putting it back where it belongs. We're putting it someplace where it's preserved. And covering over this site is what preserved it for us.
Yes, and I often wondered whether or not the people who covered it had an awareness that they needed to cover it in order to preserve it.
Yes, there's every indication that that's true. If you look at the way, I was talking about that Egyptian word for week being formulated from symbols that explained its meaning. Well, it turns out every Egyptian cosmological word that I've come across does that. If you know the right meaning to assign to the symbol, the word will explain its own original meaning to you. And furthermore, there are certain Egyptian words that do that, but at the end of the word they include a trailing glyph that doesn't get pronounced. The Egyptologists think that that trailing glyph is there for emphasis, but I can see the reason it's there is because the word defines the meaning of the glyph. And so now you can evolve a long list of Egyptian glyphs and what their meanings should be based on what the Egyptian hieroglyphic language tells us the meaning should be. And then you can test that meaning back against what the Buddhists say and back against what the Dogon say and be sure that you're in the ballpark of the right meaning. It's sort of like having the teacher's copy of the book when you were in grade school, you know, the one that had all the answers to the questions in the back?
Yes. So in our last 5 minutes that we have together, when I hear you discuss all this, I realize how profound this information is. I mean, what has it meant for you to be able to uncover this information, and how has it changed your perspective on the world? I mean, don't you think that everyone needs to know this information, because it changes everything? I mean, if we study history with a more holistic perspective of overlapping and looking for these similar symbols and how they relate, it changes our fundamental understanding of history and I think our fundamental concept of our purpose for living and how we understand and digest information. It changes everything, doesn't it? And
it does. The first thing a person like me has to adjust to when studying these things is understanding that there are things going on that we can't explain, accepting that that's true, or the possibility of that being true. In the archaic traditions that underlie this stuff, what they say the purpose is, there are two purposes. One is to help humanity understand its real place, its true place in relation to the larger processes of creation. But the second purpose is to help us evolve what they call a discriminating knowledge. In other words, the ability to look at something like this and actually see what was meant as opposed to what we thought was meant. So all of the information that was in it would, when someone at 10,000 BC encodes a code that represents something you can only see with a microscope or with a telescope, that's not aimed at an audience, a contemporary audience. That's aimed at an audience long in the future who's going to have the technology to recognize that, hey, this is the same shape as an electron orbit, or hey, this is the same shape as whatever. The audience is way out there. The idea of bearing over this site is for the benefit of that same audience. It's for someone who's going to recognize the symbols. All the people who put this together wanted was for somebody down the line to recognize it. Now, I asked myself coming into it, what right, what business do I have talking about things that were deliberately kept secret by so many cultures for so many thousands of years? Don't I have an obligation to keep those things secret also? And I looked at the material and realized that from a scientific standpoint, this material is only about 50 years ahead of where we're at right now. If the intention of the person who put it together was to benefit us scientifically, I think their idea was that sooner or later we'd notice that our religion looked an awful lot like science, and we'd figure out we could just follow the religious symbols to the science. If we're going to derive any of that benefit from this, it has to happen now. We've only got 50 years left for it to happen. And so that's the justification for me talking about it as opposed to keeping it secret.
Wow. Wow. It reminds me of conversations I've had with Edgar Mitchell when he had a very profound experience coming back from the moon, which he describes in his book, The Way of the Journeyer. And it's a profound awareness of consciousness staring him back in the face and realizing that he was space and space was him. And
right.
It almost sounds like he was on LSD, but he was not.
Right,
You know,
right. He would
he
just
had
look
to have
at
his
things in a
complete,
very different way.
his complete faculties, you know,
Yes.
maneuvering that craft to get it
Oh,
back
yeah.
to Earth.
The realization, oh, I've been looking at this all wrong, basically.
Yes, yes.
Right.
Seeing things from a new perspective. Well, I am so deeply honored to have you come and share with our listening and viewing audience today at our program here at Radnor Studio 21. I hope those of you who have heard a little bit of our conversation today and are intrigued, Googled Laird Scranton and look for some of his numerous books that he's written. And you try to tune into our programming here at Radnor Studio 21, where you'll be able to hear Laird's presentation and look for it in the programming cycle so you can see it. And we hope that you, again, tune in with us for other programming that we have, or you attend some of the programs that we run at the Tredyffrin Public Library. So to learn more about Mainline Mufon, which is the group which I have founded and is hosting Laird today, just Googled mainlinemufon.com. It stands for the Mutual UFO Network, but we're also a branch of Noetic Sciences, so we explore all sorts of topics, not just narrowly focused on the UFO concept, but on ancient history, ancient architecture, modern day science, and many other concepts, health and healing and wellness, and the list goes on from there. So if you visit the site, you can see some of our fabulous programming that we've had over the last 13 years that we've been in existence. And you can see also the program a year in advance, so what we have planned for the next year. So thank you so much for joining us. And Laird, thank you so much for being here. It's really been fabulous. It's been
My pleasure. Thanks.
a real pleasure for me.